Okay, we should be live now. Let's wait for the confirmation to see if we are actually being live. Great. Thank you. Again, some technical problems, but here we are again in our Fireside chats. Welcome, everybody. Hope you guys had a great week and another Friday to talk about interesting things about telecoms. And here today we're going to talk about satellite communications. Satellites have a very interesting history, but it seems to have a very promising future. The rise of fiber optics in terrestrial communications kind of caused a decline in the use of satellites for internet and the use of telephony. But seems like with Starlink and the OneWeb, we kind of have revived the industry from the ashes for that kind of use cases. But the reality is that with more than 2,000 satellites orbiting around Earth, we use them in our everyday lives, and we have been using them in things like the radio, the television, and many other sources of media, and some parts of the internet access. So to talk about this, we have Gonzalo with us today. He works in business development for the European Space Agency, and he has all the knowledge about space-related innovation and what's going on in the industry, and basically bridging the gap between private and public funding and helping startups get there. But let's listen from you. Welcome, Gonzalo. Thank you very much for joining us today. And would you like to explain us a little bit more what you do for the European Space Agency and what's your role there?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for hosting us today. We are very pleased to be here with Weaver Labs today. And just a little bit about myself. My name, as you said, is Gonzalo Martin. I work for European Space Agency Space Solutions, which is the innovation support program of the agency. So we do lots of things, but in particular, what we do is to try to support particularly small and medium companies to try to go to market with new products and services based on space technology. In particular, satellite telecommunications, imagery from space, and navigation technologies, PST, like GPS, GNSS, etc. And me, myself in particular, I'm basically the data master. So I'm basically the guy that is constantly checking the profile, the evolution. So I would not say that I have all the knowledge, but I have quite some knowledge on what is happening in innovation in Europe.
Exactly, and that's exactly how we met, right? Because we are a startup innovating in the telecom sector, and there are a lot of programs coming from European Space Agency that help startups bring their products to market, and we hope we can explain you a lot more about what we're going to do with the European Space Agency soon, but so far we can't. But hopefully it's going to be very, very soon. So from my perspective, like I've been in telecoms for a very long time, and for me, the satellite industry has always had this kind of like, I always had this thought that it's kind of like disconnected from the rest of the telecoms industry. We see it as something that it's not as modern, maybe as mobile communications, which that's another topic of discussion if it's modern or not. But it does not grab all these cool use cases and applications of VR and robotics and all of that we do see with 5G and Wi-Fi and other systems, right? And it would be great to hear from you a little bit of background to satellite communications and what has it been used traditionally, and why do we all have this kind of like thought about it, that it's kind of like detached from the rest of the industry?
Well, it's a very interesting question to answer. And just to be honest, I can be speaking about this for hours. As a matter of fact, when I go talking to some innovation programs with some of our partners, I just have a specific lecture on this that lasts 2 hours.
Well, let's get the short version.
Exactly. So, well, just to keep it a little bit short, so what you say is absolutely right. So there has always been this kind of disconnection between the world of satellite communications and the rest of telecommunications. And that is also for historical reasons. On the first part, satellite communications start like a military asset. So basically it was mostly done for military people to communicate themselves with the army in very secure areas, and then they start to get slowly into commercial things. And as you know very well, because this also happened when we started with the 3G generation of mobile phone, etc., there is always the problem when you go commercial. What is the killer application? What are we going to use this in order to sustain industry and try to go into that? And after a number of attempts, trial and connects, satellite telecommunications find the killer application, the most successful killer application that has ever found any kind of telecommunication technology, which is television, streaming television, pay-per-view, all these kind of technologies. The problem with pay-per-view television is that it has been so successful that the industry is at risk of dying of its own success, because it was so successful that for lots of years, a lot of telecom industry, satellite telecom industry, was thinking that there was no need to do much more than that. We are talking about a scenario that just streaming television, talking companies like a lot of satellite operators with operational margins of 80, 90%, which is unthinkable in modern times, particularly when you have into account that the traditional telecom operators, they might have a margin something between 2 and 5% if they are doing very well. So in the 80s and in the 90s, that has actually been something that has attracted a lot of investment in telecommunication satellites, particularly in high-speed broadband and lots of technologies, basically. But all these technologies are dedicated for one single purpose, which is basically to broadcast. So it's actually, when I go to lecture, I said that some of the most brilliant minds in the world work in telecommunications for you to be able to see Strictly Come Dancing or to watch football in the evenings.
Football, definitely football. That's the one.
Exactly. However, the situation starts to change in the 2000s, particularly at the end of the 2000s with the advent of YouTube, Netflix, Amazon Prime Video, etc. So it becomes very easy for everyone just to start streaming randomized content online. It's not necessary that you need to have a sequential content with a set of channels, maybe with some intelligent devices that are able to record some content for you to see. You have the possibility to access a myriad of content, streaming it online, for everything for very cheap money. And that starts a little bit the demise of satellite telecommunications industry. So the thing is that they started to see the revenues started to decrease. We are still talking about that the operational revenues of many of these companies are still in 30 to 40%. Still is a lot, but it's decreasing. If you have to explain to your shareholders, look, you were 80, 90% profitable and now you are 40 and declining, still is a good investment, but I'm not recovering the investment that I'm having. Why is like that? And well, basically this is the cause. And now the industry is trying to reconvert itself and trying to get into something which could be new. But the big problem of this, as we were saying before, is that it has been so successful that it's very difficult to find something as successful as satellite television nowadays in order to be able to recover those degrees of profile. And that's why satellite operators have started to join all the type of initiatives like 5G, IoT, smart cities, etc. So I'm not sure if this answers your questions, but happy to expand on that.
No, it's great. I think it's a great background of the industry. I think we all kind of associate satellites with the military and maybe positioning systems, but in terms of satellite communications, it would be more in the terms of television and media, and never that kind of like I get internet access through a satellite. Yep. And to me, it would make a lot of sense when I am experiencing so many problems deploying networks in my everyday life. But yeah, I guess that it's interesting to see how the satellite industry has been so profitable, and that was the reason why we never got into internet access or broadband access using constellations, right? Because if you have a killer use case that it's giving you 80% margins, and still in the decline, it's still giving you 40% margins, it's very difficult to try and find the innovation. But at the end of the day, we are seeing that that's changing now. And we have companies like Starlink and Elon Musk. It's looking at something there that maybe someone has not seen before. And there are other innovators, because we talk a lot about Starlink and their satellites and how they're going to revolutionize the broadband connectivity. But there are many other small satellites being now built for broadband. What is that opportunity there and tapping, and how can it came the innovation towards that side, leaving television, going more into broadband?
Maybe just to clarify a little bit on this thing, it's not that satellite telecommunications industry was just doing television. They were doing many other things. Remote communications, government communications, access in other areas. But there has always been this lack of investment in terms of the satellite telecommunications industry to basically go out and try to explore these cases. Exactly because you had a case that was giving gigantic amount of revenue and gigantic amount of operational profit. So this is a little bit, on the one hand, is very good, but at the same time, it's actually a deterrent for innovation.
It cripples it, yeah. When you have too much money coming in, why should I change the recipe of success, right? Yeah.
It works, don't touch it.
Exactly, principle of engineering.
Exactly. But now the problem is that situation is not the case. So the thing is, the typical case that I like to put in this case is Africa. Africa was like a virgin area, perfect for satellite communications, but they never took off for a number of reasons. The first of all is that a lot of governments, they were not very happy to basically not control the communications that were getting in and out of the country. We know that particularly in the 70s, 80s, and the beginning of the 90s, there were lots of countries in Africa that they were not totally democratic, let's say it like that, and they were willing to control communications. And satellite communications is a way through which they cannot control the access input in and out. But the other thing is that particularly through donors, we are talking about people like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the African Bank for Development. They started on this concept of the universal service funds in order to try to enable universal services like telephony, etc. And these funds are structured in such a way that you come into this kind of element and say, we are happy for you to develop your network. We are going to pay a part for it, but you have to invest. So fiber optic operators invested. And that's the reason why they started to get a lot of money, because it was a good case. It's like developing a fiber optic network is expensive. And through these schemes, we can actually save as a minimum half of the deployment cost. So it's a good business. And then we can start in cities, and then we can expand into other areas. Satellite telecommunications never did this. And therefore, they were basically dragging behind and basically never getting into the full potential that they could have realized in this area. Coming back to your question now. So you're saying that why everyone is starting to get into this kind of element. The problem is that now fiber optic companies are facing exactly that kind of same case that we were having with satellite telecommunication. It's not that they are streaming television, but yes, they are streaming television. But they are in a model in which basically they share a lot of capacity. And the thing is that, we are very interested in sharing capacity, capability, bandwidth, really a lot of that. But the problem with bandwidth is that it's a low added value model. You don't really provide added value services that can get into that. And it's still expensive. There is a lot of support in order to try to expand broadband, and there are here in the UK lots of government programs in order to try to expand that. But still, it's a very expensive activity. And here is when someone like Elon Musk comes into the game and says, so there is a lot of people that they don't get broadband, or they get actually not really frequent, because actually the conditions are not the most ideal one for broadband operators. There are not necessarily universal service funds in order to try to expand all these kind of things in countries like the US or Europe, because the connectivity is actually quite good, even if it is not necessarily very big broadband. And the infrastructure costs are very big. What if we can try to do that with satellite? There were some attempts to do this in the 90s, but unfortunately didn't succeed because there was also another set of problems we can talk in another day. But now the thing is actually working because of that, because Elon Musk is basically is making a lot of fuss about it. Really
he has a lot of propaganda behind him that helps the industry, right?
Yeah. Exactly. But also, he basically counts with the fact that there is a lot of people that in the US, there is basically if I remember right, approximately 30 to 40% of the people that live in areas not well served with fiber. It's not that they are not served, but they are not well served. But still, they would like to have access to these wonderful services. Absolutely. And Elon Musk comes and says, perfect, we can do that. We can create the IP satellite that is going to provide you internet access. And the only thing you have to do is to put this wonderful terminal that we are getting here. And from there, you can have access to all kinds of services through the internet, including Netflix, Amazon Prime Video, and all these kind of things. Curiously, this also creates a problem because the traditional satellite telecommunication industry, despite the fact that they can provide access to the internet, the architecture is not thought for that kind of thing. So it's mostly thought for pure broadcast. It's a point-to-multipoint communication. So for the people that is not familiar with this, is one element that is streaming and a lot of people that are receiving the same streaming at the same time.
Perfect for television.
Exactly. Radio and this kind of stuff, but not perfect when you're trying to do banking or when you're trying to do randomized content, like, for example, what happens with YouTube, where you basically need to have interaction, come and forth to do that.
Exactly.
So that's basically, it requires quite an investment from the satellite operators in order to adapt their models to get into that kind of thing. And this is, for example, one of the rules of ESA. We are working with a lot of satellite operators in order to try to define new architectures that will allow flexibility in order to try to get into that. However, we have to recognize that while on the technology we can do lots of things, when we are talking about innovation, your route to market strategy and the marketing that you can actually do also counts a lot. And in that place, I think that Elon Musk is the king, and there is very little we can do. I mean, you see Starlink news every day, but do you see news about a common telecom operator, satellite telecom operator?
Not really. I mean, there are good things about it, I think, for the industry that you show people to talk about these things. I mean, from our side at Weaver Labs, it's sometimes very difficult to explain why we're doing innovation in telecoms, an industry that has struggled to bring innovation and people like him help new generations, first of all, to get interested in the actual industry, but also to to talk about the problems that we face, like what you're telling me about digital divide and people not getting connected. That's a real problem, and he's actually facing that problem and solving it. So that's great for the industry, and I really hope that we get more people to talk about that, because it incentivizes others to try and copy that model. Exactly. But it's really interesting that you touch upon a topic that, when I'm coming from the 5G world and the terrestrial communications world, it's about how can we use satellite to help aid the problems that we have when we are building 5G networks, right? So one of the biggest problems that I have and I experience, and you have mentioned that, it's fiber networks, and how I struggle to get antennas connected to gateways that bring the traffic to the internet, right? So we connect with our phones to an antenna, and that antenna connects to a cable, typically, and brings all that traffic to the internet to go where it has to be, either to YouTube or to another terminal, another phone terminal, right? And we have always thought about, from the terrestrial communications point, why don't we use satellites to carry all of that data from the antennas to wherever it has to be, right? It will help us a lot in what we call the backhaul, right? To make mobile networks be easier to deploy. But it has been very difficult to see that partnership or that integration from satellite operators and mobile network operators to work together to truly integrate the two technologies and help create universal networks. Why is that? Why has that been so difficult?
Well, this is also has to do quite a lot with the business model of telecom operators that was dominant one until more or less nowadays. And the model, it was that me as a telecom operator, a traditional telecom operator, I would like to own all the assets that I operate, because this actually provides me a competitive advantage in an environment where basically my business model is about capacity. I can control everything. And the problem with satellite telecommunications, as we explained before, traditionally and still today, they are like a kind of separate world of the rest of telecommunication technologies. So yes, satellite telecommunication is a wonderful tool for backhauling, to basically try to drive massive amounts of content and bandwidth of information into different places without having to come into big investments. But the problem is exactly that, is that you have to convince a telecom operator that he needs to share access to his network and lose certain control to that asset. And until very recently, they have never been very happy to do that, particularly because there have been quite a number of things regarding technology evolution that has prevented that. This has been actually very much all the fact concerning simple communications, the model, the client service paradigm that basically I can just put things and go down. And but there are starting to be a number of cases where, apart from backhauling, for example, the case of Internet of Things, machine to machine, is actually a perfect case for communications. But
let me stop you there, one moment. Let me stop you there, because I think you touched upon a very interesting point, that it's the ownership model, right? Yes. And yes, there's many other applications, and I want to talk about that, and we will touch that in a minute. But I want to stay a little bit on the ownership model, because that's something that we experience a lot working in terrestrial communications, how the ownership model is changing, right? So I do agree that traditionally mobile network operators have wanted to own the infrastructure, but that has led to poor universal coverage, right? Because and not to blame them, it's a massive investment, and if you have to own the entire infrastructure and you have to be paying for all of these assets to be deployed, it's a very big burden to put into very few players of the market. And instead, what it's happening now, what we see happening is that we are saying we need to diversify the supply chain. We need to bring more players that bring these assets and invest. And now we share all of these assets. But and that model has existed a little bit in the fiber optics world, for example, right? So I don't see mobile network operators laying fiber. What I see is mobile network operators doing agreements with fiber companies that own fiber in large places, and that model kind of works. It's not perfect. It's far from being perfect, and I think it's related to the points that you were mentioning before. But why has it been different with satellite? Like why satellites have struggled to build these partnerships even in shared ownership models?
Well, it's basically because for lots of years, shareholders of satellite operators have been the state, and the state would like to have this as a kind of basically particular asset for themselves, for basically to secure, because it has been a strategic sector that is employing hundreds of thousands of people in Europe and in the world. So what they don't want is basically to lose control, and because it has never been extremely profitable. It was a very high-tech industry for certain things, and employing a lot of very qualified employment, but it was not really very commercial. And because there has been this, it's a little bit also coming back to the same story. If I have one model that is giving me a lot of money, why I should do this?
Why change it, right?
But this is also a little bit also like, if I might say a little bit of a politically incorrect word, a little bit prepotence from the side of telecom operators, because it's like, look, I don't need to do this. I have a model, which is the television one, that is giving me a lot of margin and a lot of revenue. Why I need to complicate my life into these things? You want to collaborate with me? Great. These are my conditions. Take them or leave it.
Yeah, well, it sounds familiar. Let's see what happens in the fiber industry in some years time. So let's try and like fast forward a little bit, and where are we going, right? So you mentioned new applications for Internet of Things. We work with a company in Germany that are using satellites to monitor fires, and there are many other innovations happening in the context of smart cities. And like it would be great to see more of this happening, right? And how seamlessly all these telecoms assets come together. Where do you see it fitting? Where is the innovation taking satellite for in the future?
It's a little bit difficult to say because there are like quite a number of things happening. So there's a perfect storm happening at the moment in which basically the traditional model of telecommunications, satellite telecommunications, is still very profitable, but it's basically declining. And a lot of the operators are trying to see how they can actually change that. And they are, of course, it happens with a lot of these traditional industries that are basically challenged by incumbents in the market to try to do new things, that they are trying to maintain the model, try to make adjustments, and try to see how that actually goes forward. But there are many other things coming out. So one of the things that we see is that there are a lot of incumbents that are coming with very small satellites that are trying to provide access, for example, on the Internet of Things, which is the clear end-to-end case on 5G communications using space. Mm-hmm. A lot of people think a lot about 5G as a lot of broadband and a super fast speed, but it's not like that. No. 5G is basically how we can basically make give the access to the network the same sort of broadband capabilities that you have when you download content, in order to allow, for example, what we are doing today, like which is broadcast, but in massive quantities. So the Internet of Things is the perfect case to do that. And that actually, of course, is a challenge for traditional satellite operators, because our very big satellite telecommunications with lots of terabits per second of capacity, etc., cost several hundreds of millions. Mm-hmm. While you go into the IoT, and an incumbent can launch a constellation of 20, 30 satellites for very little money in comparison. Maybe with 10 to 30 million euros, you can basically launch a constellation, especially if you get back from some investors and get into that. So that's actually one area where things are actually going on. But there are lots of exciting things going on. We are not sure if anything will actually get into a technology, but for example, a blockchain applied to satellite communications is one area that we see that is actually exploding. Utilization of artificial intelligence, and also the development of what we call the low Earth orbit economy. With the low Earth economy, the first case has actually been imagery from space, trying to get lots of things. But they are trying to get lots of pictures from lots of areas in order to try to show that. But there are lots of exciting things coming, like, for example, edge computing via satellite. You get, for example, some pictures, and you store them and send the picture to another satellite, or just to a constellation of satellites to do a little bit of edge computing. And there are certain cases where you have the data stored in the satellite and download when it's necessary, not, for example, in real time. And there are many other things, like, for example, laser communications. Inside the European Space Agency, we are working with industry to develop optical communications via space, which would be a complete game changer in terms of bandwidth and capabilities to access.
Wow, that's incredible.
So those are some of the things that we see. Where the future will take us is a little bit to see. I'm not probably the most qualified person to say that, but I think that optical communication seems to me a lot of noise, and also the IP satellite in order to try to have access. And I think that actually has the potential to disrupt existing models and try to have, hopefully, a more accessible and more democratic internet in the future.
I am really certainly looking forward to that, and I think a lot of people that are listening to us think that it's great to have such a promising future for this industry. We are getting some comments on the chat, and a question. So there is a question that says, "Hello all, what's your thoughts on application-specific CubeSats in LEO?"
Well, that's what we were saying before. It's one of the future technologies. There is a lot of a low Earth orbit economy that is actually trying to develop. But let me get a little bit back onto that. So basically, All this economy is developing because agencies like NASA, ourselves, and the Chinese Space Agency, they are basically trying to reach to Mars or to Jupiter or to some of these planets.
Far away.
Exactly, steps that have to be built. The first step is basically decrease the launching capacity, the cost of launchers. So this is basically one of the things that we are getting there. We still are not there, but are getting there. And thanks to that, it enables the potential to many things, like even the case we were talking a few years ago, like even myself as an individual can have my own CubeSat to launch it to whatever things I can actually think. I think that still we are a little bit away from there, but just to come specifically to the questions, all this enable CubeSats to do lots of nice things, like for example, IoT. We work with a lot of companies in Europe that are working on IoT via satellite, which is a fantastic application, but also in other things that I have mentioned, like for example, blockchain applications, communication between satellites, etc. The CubeSat has actually one advantage with respect to the traditional satellite. I mean, the traditional satellite has a lot of advantages as well, not get me wrong. But the very big advantage of the CubeSat is that you can launch it, you can test it, get a lot of data on how it operates, and in very short period of time, because it's inexpensive, launch another one, improving whatever you have actually done. And this is what lots of companies are actually doing. This was the model that was pioneered by Spire and Planet Labs through the investment in Silicon Valley. And it's a model that is actually touching. Of course, incumbents come and say, yeah, a CubeSat will never have the quality of a satellite, of a traditional satellite communication. And maybe they are right. But the question is, all the applications need
exactly. That's the point. That's the point, right? And we see that happening with mobile communications as well, right? That we have now it's being commoditized, and we actually see now how the ownership model has changed, and you do have people, individuals that can own a network of their own, exactly. Right? And that it's excellent. And it might come the fact that you can own a satellite. I would like to own a satellite to get my communications and to streamline the process. I think that's excellent, and I'm really glad to see the industry moving there and to see how we are bringing innovation in an industry that so far has looked quite old and difficult to move. If telecoms industry definitely looks as an old industry, I think satellite always has this perception of being the oldest one. But there are all sorts of cool things that are happening. So I think it's really interesting to hear about this. Gonzalo, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. Maybe we would like to close with some thoughts for you. Where do you see it in 10 years' time? Where would you like to see it in 10 years' time?
Well, what I would like to say is basically like we have started to reach to the moon, and we are starting to build. We have an internal concept within ESA that we call NetStar, which is the space internet. So basically, with all these kind of things that we are developing and talking about, like going to Mars or mining asteroids, the space resources initiatives, etc., we will need something like that. And we have lots of very good technologies, but I still believe that in order to be able to exploit the true potential of all these initiatives, we will need to develop something like the internet in space. And this requires to rethink lots of things. So how we can basically have links down to Earth, how we can have buffers in space in order to store and make a kind of IP model in space to get lots of communication technologies, how we can basically fast forward links with optical communications, so lots of things. So I actually believe that there will be like a slowdown on the traditional models. There will be a race of these incumbents. We will see a little bit what will happen in terms of ownership, because at certain point of time there will be some buying of certain things. But for sure, we will see like a kind of, in my opinion, a healthier telecom sector, and hopefully satellite telecommunications integrated within the landscape of technologies of enabled by 5G and other areas. This will enable also lots of applications like smart cities, IoTs, things that we are doing. But also in terms of research, we have to basically look forward. And I'm very excited about the possibility to try to start working on something like a cosmic internet, as we try to call it, to enable.
I love that word, the cosmic internet. I really love it. Thank you very much for those closing remarks. We're getting some other comments around reducing costs and around the terms of in terms of how much the number of satellites. I think we could be talking about this for a very long time, but we're way over the time and we don't want to take more of yours. So thank you so much, Gonzalo. This has been great. I've enjoyed so much talking about this. And if you guys want to reach out to Gonzalo with your startup, with your ideas, there are a lot of programs from European Space Agency. We have been part of one with Data and Aurora Tech, and we also want to open up that channel for other startups, because it's great to work with the European Space Agency, and there are a lot of opportunities to get your product out there. So reach out to us, and happy to connect you to them. And exciting times. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening, and talk to you soon.
Has been a pleasure to be here, and hope that you will be able to host us again very soon. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.